Hi everybody, this is Angela Page and welcome to week 5 of Love Your Rebellion's Poetry for the People. So in week 5 we will be talking about line breaks. We're going to talk about how this impacts the reader's interpretation of the work and other aspects of the poem. So just a little bit of background about Poetry for the People. I created this workshop in order to help people just focus on something for the last 5 weeks or so, and really was just wanting to give people something to look forward to each week and a way to develop their skills in poetry, maybe while they are looking for some stuff to do right now. So in week 1, we talked about imagery, and that is about vivid descriptions. In week 2, we talked about simile and metaphor, which most of you probably are familiar with, but we talked about how to create really unique similes and metaphors in week 2. And then in week 3, we talked about juxtaposition. So simile and metaphor is about comparison, juxtaposition is about contrast. So that's when we talked about that. And then in week 4, we talked about slant rhyme and more specifically consonants and assonance. So this has to do with the cadence or the sound and rhythm that the poem has based on the assonance and consonants and other aspects of syntax. So if you'd like to go back and look at any of those past classes, you're welcome to do so. You can find each one on the Love Your Rebellion website, loveyourrebellion.org. You can also find full videos on our Love Your Rebellion YouTube channel and on the Love Your Rebellion Facebook page. So feel free to check those out, and they will be up for as long as I can have them up, essentially. So I hope you enjoy them. So as for today, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about line breaks. So a lot of people might think that line breaks are not important, or maybe they are done in a very casual manner without a lot of reasoning behind them, but that actually couldn't be farther from the truth. The majority of poets really spend a lot of time thinking about where they're going to place their line breaks, and this is because it has a really drastic impact on how the poem is read. So as we move through this lesson, you're going to see 2 poems that have differences in their line breaks, and we're going to figure out how that impacts the work. I'll give you a couple of exercises on how to practice using line breaks or not using line breaks, as it were. And we're going to learn a little bit about what makes a line break, if that makes sense. So let's just jump right into it. If you see me looking up, that is because I'm looking at my presentation, which I'm going to share with you right now. Let me just get the share going. Okay, so now you should see my presentation. You should also see me up in the corner there. So line breaks. Let's first talk about why line breaks are important. So line breaks matter because they affect 3 things about the poem, 2 of which are significantly important to how the poem is read. So appearance is the first one. So this is literally just how the poem looks on the page, whether the lines are short or long, or maybe they have big spaces between them, or indentations, or like it's an E. Cummings poem and the line work is all over the page. But most of the time, poems have a pretty common type of line break, a line scheme. You know, you'll see lines and then a couplet or 3 or 4, or maybe a whole poem that's like a free verse poem that's just one giant stanza. So we're not going to talk too much about stanzas today because that's different from line breaks, but we are going to talk about line breaks themselves, and more specifically, how they impact meter and syntax, or rather how meter and syntax impacts a line break. So what do these things have to do with a line break? So we're going to learn a little bit more about that, but first I want to present this quote from Kim Adonisio. And it says, "Not all poems are written in lines. The opposite of this is also true. Not everything written in lines is a poem." So this is very important. And the reason that I say that this is very important is because you have to understand that just because you wrote something and broke it down into lines does not mean it's a poem. It has to have a lot of other aspects of poetic device in order for it to be considered a poem, like imagery, simile, metaphor, juxtaposition. It has to have a cadence. there's got to be some of the poetic devices that we discussed in our previous classes for it to be really considered a poem. Likewise is true in the opposite direction. So there are these things called prose poems. Prose poems appear as paragraphs. They don't have line breaks like a traditional poem would have, but they have a bunch of other techniques, poetic techniques in it that would make it so that it would be a poem, so that it wouldn't be something like flash fiction, for example, which is a very short narrative, fictional narrative. But, you know, the differences here that I really want you to understand is that a line break does not a poem make. So that's a nice little silly rhyme, but, you know, just because you have lines in a poem that are broken apart does not make it a poem. You might have seen this kind of played upon when people sort of make jokes about poetry or something like that. But really, the truth of the matter is that you have to think more beyond breaking things into lines in order for it to really be considered a poem. So then what is a line break? Well, a line break is determined by two things, the two of the things that I brought up earlier, meter and syntax. So here's where things get a little bit complex when it comes to poetry. So when we talked about imagery and simile and metaphor and some of the other broader concepts, it can be very clear, and they're big or large parts of the poem, you know, because you can kind of tell what a metaphor is. It takes up a lot of the space, or it might be like one of the main focuses of the poem or something like this. But when it comes to meter, and in our past class, I would also say this is true about consonants and assonants and any type of sound devices, that they're much more analytical and deep. So this type of stuff really comes when the poet is trying to shape the work. And also it could be used as a device to shape the work. So it's sort of like going deeper in order to get a better sense of what the poem is or what the work is trying to do. So, but if we talk about meter, meter is literally the syllabic content. So it's literally the beats per line. And you may say to yourself, well, lines or sound or words have beats. Yeah, words have beats, and the beats are the syllables. So if you see my examples here, there's two types of syllabic patterns, and well, there's the two main types. There are additional ones, but these are the ones that we mostly see. One is the pattern of unstressed being first, and then the stressed syllable being afterwards. And then the other would be the stressed syllable being first and the unstressed being afterwards. If you really listen to certain words, or you partner certain words that have the same stressed and unstressed combinations, you'll eventually hear the music of those types of syllables combinations, because like something that goes da dot, da dot, da dot is probably this stressed and unstressed. The poet, you know, so you have that da dot sort of like musicality to the line. So, and this actually came into play when I had class this past week when we talked about this concept. One of the poets in the class talked about how she always has the same cadence in her work, this da-dat, 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 da-dat. And, you know, I said, well, you should really break it down and figure out what kind of syllable patterns you have, because if you have the same syllable pattern over and over again, you're probably going to get this very similar type of sound throughout all your work. And she was like, that's pretty helpful because I haven't been able to break this pattern. So now I'll be able to figure that out. Well, if you have the same kind of problem where you feel like this poems all literally sound the way they come out of your mouth, they sound the same, it's probably because you have some kind of combination of these that is making the music of the poem all the same. So when we listen to these words, we can hear how they're stressed or unstressed. We really rest on the end of the word define. And same thing is true about poet. You're really enhancing the first syllable when you say this word. So think about these as patterns of stressed and unstressed. When you combine these types of patterns, and specifically the two syllable types, they create a rhythm. That's where you get the poem's overall movement. And so this is very important to consider. When we look at the works that are coming up, you'll be able to kind of tell what I'm talking about when I am talking about the music or how the syllabic content plays a role in the sound of each line and then the sound of the work overall. So in free verse, meter can be used to create rhythm or emphasis. So sometimes you might see a word by itself. Usually the poet wants you to focus on this word, or two words coupled by themselves or something like this. Usually it's because the poet wants you to really focus on that. So some things to consider. The next part of a line break is the syntax. So as in the most simple phrases, syntax is just the string of words, the phrase in the line. How many are there? Is it a common pause when the line actually breaks? Is it jarring as to where the line breaks? You will see syntax as just the arrangement of phrases in a line, literally. The arrangement of each word in a phrase. This can talk about the poet's play with syntax for cadence and mood. So the way that you actually arrange the string of words has an impact on the musicality of the poem, and as well as how the poem feels. So that sounds kind of weird, but again, when we get to the two pieces that we're going to look at, you'll see how this plays a role. Syntax is kind of a tricky thing for people to understand. However, if you pay attention to the way that someone just naturally talks, you'll see that there are pauses in phrasing. So you'll see that there are natural pauses that people take in order to take breaths. However, sometimes these sorts of things may be common in a poem where it would break, the end of the line would break during a natural pause. Like, for example, what I just did there, the last few sentences I said didn't really have natural pauses in them, but the sentences prior to that did. And it was probably a little bit easier for you to understand the sentences that had the natural pauses versus the sentences that didn't. You might have to go back and listen to the sentences that didn't really have natural pauses. So that's something to also keep in mind when we think about syntax. Usually a common line break will have a pause, or that line break itself, in a natural or common place that you would hear if someone was having a conversation with someone else. So think about this because we call usually we call the I, or if there is an I in a poem, we call that the speaker. And so think about that when you think about syntax, because a poem is supposed to be spoken. Yes, it is read, obviously, but it is also a part of performance of the poem. And when you read it out loud, it should also have this musicality, and there will be impacts based on where you place those line breaks when it comes to pauses. So let's take a look at a couple of poems now. So now we have this baseline understanding that meter, or the number of syllables per line, as well as the syntax, the way that those syllables are arranged in words and phrases, have an impact on a line break. That is what a line break is made up of. It's made up of meter and syntax, okay? So we're gonna read a couple of poems, and we're gonna try to figure out what the meter and syntax of each poem does to the poem itself, okay? So just take a minute and read this along with me. I'm gonna read it out loud, just follow along, and really think about the syllables per line, if you can get your head there. And then also, where are the natural pauses in this? Do they come at the end of the line, each line, or not? Okay. So I thought this poem was very apropos for the times that we're living in. And it actually is very positive, although the name might not allude to that. So let's read it together. It's called Bad Year by Jane Hirschfeld. Even in this bad year, the apples grow heavy and round. 3 friends and I trade stories: biopsy, miscarriage, solitude, a parent's unraveling body or mind. What is reliable? What do you hold? I demand of the future later. The future, whose discretion is perfect, says nothing, but rolls another apple loose from its grip. A hopeful yellow jacket comes to hunt the crack, the point of easy entry. Okay, So this poem, to me, is very traditional. It's traditional in the sense that it flows very normal or close to average pauses in speech. The way that the lines break is pretty common. Okay, so let's like really take a look at the line breaks in terms of syntax first. So syntax would be how the phrasing of each line is broken up and the arrangement of words. So the arrangement of words in the first two lines is pretty normal, right? I mean, you kind of have this sentence broken apart into punctuation end of the line. So when we have punctuation at the end of the line, it's often called an end stop poem, or an end stop line. And so we can consider a comma to be a pretty heavy pause. We can consider this colon to be a pretty heavy pause, question mark, period, a dash. So pretty much the majority of the first part of this poem has some sort of punctuation, and they all differ from each other. There's a few periods, obviously, but she's got quite an array of punctuation. And what this makes us do is it makes us slow down. So it makes us pause here slightly because we have a comma. This makes us stop almost completely because we have a punctuation. It's like, I think of this as like a stop sign. This is like a yield sign. This is like a stop sign, right? We have a colon here, which colon is a directive. It tells us, look what comes after. It's like what comes after explains what I just said. That's kind of what a colon does. So when we look at this here, the stories are what is in the following line. So we're kind of being told, like, here are the stories to come, and actually they're in the following two lines. And you also have the comma here and the period here. So this part feels very slow. Same thing with this. In this line, you actually have two pieces of end stop punctuation. And this is really important to consider because up until this point, there are no complete sentences in two complete sentences in one line other than this line right here, right? And actually there's no other place. I mean, I guess you could consider the dashes, but they are not things that make us stop. We'll get to that. They're not things that necessarily make us stop. But these make us stop. They make us pause because there's a question there. It's rhetorical in a way. There's two questions there. So these portions are very slow. They're very slow. And what really slows us down when we talk about syntax is the fact that there's punctuation at the end of each line, okay? Here and here. We have a period here, very like sturdy, stop. A hyphen is more like, look over there for a second, like an aside or something, like someone whispering in your ear or adding an additional detail to the story. That's what this is. But then in the last four lines, punctuation loosens a little bit. And we have the only two lines in the poem that are what we call enjambed, or they have enjambment, which means that the line spills over with no punctuation onto the next line. So what this does is it speeds it up a little bit. So we had all this stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, until we get down here and we talk about the future, which is intentional, I think. We start talking about the future and then all of a sudden things get quicker. So, and you know, to me, this really contributes to the mood of the poem. So, you know, you have this sort of feeling, like I said, in this beginning part where it's like maybe very stuck in a place because we've got all this punctuation. And think about what she's talking about here. She's talking about like the shit that her friends and her are going through. And I mean, we can really all relate to this right now. You know, she's just talking about this terrible stuff that her and her friends are going through. And, you know, and also this uncertainty. And I think that like having the dual punctuation in one line really speaks to the level of uncertainty that she has, because we're almost frozen by uncertainty sometimes. It stops us dead in our tracks and makes us think again, you know? And so I really feel like she wanted to communicate that. Instead of breaking these into two lines, they don't come it's not like there's a nice balance between them. They're back to back, and they feel very demanding as well as uncertain and concerning. So again, very stop and go. And then as we see the future come into the picture, there's a personification here, which is a type of metaphor. So in the poem, Hirschfeld is comparing the future to some kind of human entity, some kind of humanoid entity that has hands that an apple can roll out of. So in my mind, I always picture a woman. I don't know why, but in my head, I always see like sort of this Grecian goddess, you know, rolling casually, listlessly rolling an apple out of her hand, like whatever will be kind of thing. And again, there's this like image of something rolling, and then we get these rolling lines that don't have punctuation at the end of them, that are, like I said, have enjambment or are enjambed instead. In other words, they continue on to the next line without a piece of punctuation separating them. All of these are end stopped, and then we have enjambment here in these two lines and here in these two lines. And maybe you get the sense as well that things may be lightening, and maybe there's motion again, movement again. And of course, you have this last line, these last two lines rather, that really speak to the opportunity of the future, or the opportunity maybe of disaster. Because she talks about a yellow jacket comes to hunt the crack, the point of easy entry. And I think she means the crack of the apple, like the apple has fallen and cracked open. That's again what my assumption, but that's what I see from these metaphors. But really we want to focus on the fact that she has all this nice description, and things start to open up at the end here, and we're talking more about the future and possibility of the future. And so there's not as much slowness, not as much stop and go, not as much the feeling of being stuck in the line because of these punctuations at the end. So now let's talk about the meter. So we talked a little bit about the syntax and how that shapes the work, but let's talk about how the syllables per line, okay? So if we start with the first line, we have all monosyllabic words here, meaning each of these words only has one syllable. So let me tell you this. I'm just gonna flat out say it. The fewer syllables in a word, the faster you will read that word and the words around it, especially if they're all monosyllabic. However, the more syllables you have in a word, the slower that will roll off the tongue, and the slower the line will go, especially if there's multi-syllables in each word in the line. So we start off like punching, even in this bad year. We start off with these very fast, but then a stop, which is the comma. There's a yield. Then we have this next line where there's, again, a lot of monosyllabic words. There's only two that are dual syllable, that have two syllable words, which is apples and heavy. Same thing here. We don't have that many multi-syllable words. A lot of them are monosyllabic. But then in this line, we have three words that have more syllables than almost all of the three lines before it, in a way. Biopsy has 3 syllables. Miscarriage, also 3. Solitude, also 3. So here there's 9 syllables, where in this first 2 lines, you had maybe 10, 11. I didn't count, so if I'm wrong, excuse me, but you have a lot of syllables packed in here, plus these yield signs, punctuations. This is intentional, y'all. This is not a mistake. It is not a mistake that she uses a lot of multi-syllabic words in this one line here, because it slows us down. The additional punctuation forces us to stop and really process these 3 things here, as well as all of the syllables that come after in this line: appearance, unraveling, body or mind. So this is where these are the stories, the crap stories that her friends are telling. Somebody got a biopsy, somebody had a miscarriage, somebody is very much alone, and someone is dealing with a parent who has dementia or some kind of mental illness that is causing them problems. So all of this is so heavy, and she does a lot of work to make sure that you feel the weight. The multisyllabic lines, the heavy punctuation. And then we go back to kind of like single syllables again, this punchiness, maybe not to drag the whole piece down. So there is like, again, the feeling of this stop and go, because some of the lines have very few syllables, some of them have a ton. So the ones that have very few syllables are going to read faster, but then they force you to stop at the end of the line because there's always some kind of pause there. Same thing is true about these multisyllabic lines with the punctuation. These are wretchedly slow. It's like the agonizing moments of life, the waiting, the quarantine. I mean, it really does like just carry this very heavy weight. And then things, again, they start to lighten up and things move faster down here. And we don't have a lot of multisyllable words. There's a lot, it's maybe like 2 to 3 syllables in a word, but you might only have like 1 3-syllable word per line, like discretion or another, but mostly you only have 2, like perfect, or 1, like the, future, who, is. Those are all monosyllabic. Same thing with this line, same thing with this line. So with that combination and no punctuation to stop it from kind of continuing to roll, it really does pick up speed. She uses the same tactics that she uses up here, but with not as much punctuation and a little bit of enjambment, and that helps us move more quickly through the work overall. So it may seem silly to put this level of analysis into a piece, but I'm telling you that the poet did. And it is important to consider how the words you use actually shape the rhythm of the line. And what the rhythm of the line is communicating. Do you want something to feel erratic? Do you want something to feel wild? Well, then you're not going to use end stop lines. Do you want something to feel stable, or something to feel stuck, or something to feel like more like cement than sand? Then you are going to use a lot of end stop. So, and I know, again, that we're trying to assign feeling to punctuation and syllable and syntax and all that stuff, but that is what poetry is. Poetry is about creating feeling based on what's on the page. And that includes the number of syllables per line, how each line is phrased, and where you are taking your line breaks, and whether those line breaks have punctuation at the end or not, or internally even. So let's move on to the next one. This is a very well-known postmodern writer, Charles Bukowski. You've probably seen his name before if you are a fan of poetry. Maybe you've read his work. He is very popular amongst postmodern poetry. He is probably he's in that class of writers who started to really mess with line breaks and how phrasing was used or syntax was used in a poem, and like kind of left the old days of like sonnets and this really strict meter behind. Some of his contemporaries did it even more freely. Like I mentioned, E.E. Cummings. He's probably the person you most associate with really dramatic uses of line breaks. But really, it's Bukowski who has probably the most digestible use of line breaks, even with his erratic ways of doing it. So we have a poem by Bukowski called Hello, Ham Son. This is a little different here. So, after 2 1/2 bottles that have not strengthened my saddened heart, walking from this drunken darkness toward the bedroom, thinking of Hamson, who ate his own flesh to gain time to write, I trundle into the other room, an old man, a hellfish in the night swimming upward, sideways, down. So first I want to say that the tone of this poem is very different. I think that it's pretty clear, even though Hirschfeld's poem is talking about some things that might be difficult to handle or kind of heavy, she still really has a lightness. There's still sort of a softness or a lightness to that poem, whereas Bukowski has a really hard, cold feeling to this poem. And we're going to look at not only how those are created through syntax and meter, but how the words that each poet actually uses contributes to the overall feeling and how it works within each line. So Bukowski's line breaks are really different than Hirschfeld's, right? And again, we're not going to talk about the stanza breaks, which are these larger breaks between chunks of lines, but we are going to talk about his actual line breaks, where his lines end. So the first thing you probably notice is that there's no punctuation. There's no punctuation in the entire poem until we get to this last word. So it's almost like one giant run-on sentence. It would be different if there was no period at all. So think about this for a second. Why would Bukowski write an entire piece with no punctuation and then put a period? It's intentional. It's not a mistake. If it was casual, I mean, maybe I couldn't imagine it, I guess, is what I'm saying. It's because, you know, why would you put the period there? What's the point? If this is all one run-on sentence, what's the point of this period? And to me, the intention is to say down, like end. So when we look at the actual meaning of the poem, it's really the story of a man who is so sad he's drank himself into an oblivion and is stumbling in towards his bedroom maybe to get some rest finally. And he's sort of like, you can see the imagery of him sort of like ambling to do that. And the last thing that he does is go down. That could mean he passed out. That could mean he blacked out. That could mean he woke up that way the next day and assumed that that's what happened. But in the end, he puts a period there to let you know that's the end of that. That's where that ended. No question about it. So if there wasn't a period, there might be a question of, does this story go on? But he's here to let you know, no, in fact, it does not. And so the rest of the line breaks, we kind of have to pick apart then. So if we start, the other thing you might notice, probably the second most prominent, or maybe the first most prominent thing, is that each of these stanzas ends with one word, each one of them. Even if they have a massive amount of words per line in some of these other lines, you know what I mean? It's like he wants you to notice them. So like I said, when we were talking about the explanations for each of these things, people who write free verse like Bukowski will often leave one word out to kind of create emphasis. And if you read the 4 words themselves, heart, right, man, down, they're kind of the subjects of the poem, aren't they? The saddened heart, the story of Samson, the old man who is the speaker in the poem, and then the experience of the last moments of the poem, which is the down part, passing out or falling asleep or falling down, who knows? But in this drunken state. So the other thing to consider here is how each line is broken apart. So in this first stanza here, we have these longer lines. After 2 1/2 battles that have not strengthened my saddened heart, then we sort of have this broken, sometimes we can get out a whole phrase with normal phrasing, sometimes we can't. So when I say sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, I mean walking from this drunken darkness. So why break this down into the next line? Maybe for emphasis, or maybe to also show that the speaker's ability to communicate is receding. So have you ever hung out with someone who's really drunk, or spoken to someone who's really drunk? Sometimes they're really clear and they can get a whole phrase out, like toward the bedroom, And sometimes they can't. Sometimes they can get out like a chunk. Ate his own flesh too, and then they sort of trail off. Or it's staggered, and the breaths that the person takes might not be as common. So I think this is also an effort to kind of see the level of drunkenness that this person is experiencing, this broken apart, sort of like massively stumbling, sort of, you know, drunken fool. I mean, not to place anything on Bukowski, but, you know, so, and you know, the way that it's broken apart also, again, you have like conjunctions in there. You know, you have these linking verbs instead of full phrases. And, you know, instead of gain time to write, gain time to write. And so when we, again, the pacing is impacted. So when we have these words that are so heavily enjammed, these sentences that are so heavily enjammed, and you don't finish the phrase, it runs down to the next line. What it does is it pulls your eyes down the page because you're trying to finish the thought, but the thought doesn't really have an end. The stanza breaks kind of act as that, but really there isn't until that punctuation there at the end. So you just sort of, your eyes just sort of continue. That's kind of just how you read it. We can also consider how each line's, the verbiage that is used in each line and how that impacts the overall tone of the poem. So as I said, this poem feels a little bit colder, a little bit bleaker, and I think that that's really in comparison to Hirschfeld's poem that feels a little bit lighter. And like, if we look at the words in this poem, darkness, eating your own flesh, the word trundle, which really makes me think of this shuffling sort of troll-like monster that is trying to get into the bedroom, the word hellfish, saddened. These words communicate a bleakness, a darkness, maybe a hopelessness or a pain that the speaker is feeling. And then the line breaks amplify that. They don't soften the blow. It's not like you have this very serene idea of sadness where you have these complete thoughts about, you know, maybe the introspection of this sadness or something like this. No, you have this rattled, drunken man who was trying to, I guess, assuage his heart, his sad heart, by drinking too much, and that didn't work, and now he's sort of stumbling in this very gross way into a bedroom and to pass out. So the line breaks kind of complement that. And if we were going to go back really quick to Hirschfeld's poem, even though this is a bad year, there is something very calming and measured about the way that she does the line breaks, because it's very common to vernacular. The uncertainty of the future and the fact that she does this enjambment here and has like this innocuous word, it's not an important word that ends the line, another is not important, and maybe the end of the phrase would probably more so be like, but rolls another apple. So she decides to, again, break these lines into something similar to what Bukowski has done here, who ate, so that she can maybe create this same kind of mood that Bukowski is creating throughout his entire poem, this uncertainty, this sort of like weirdness, and the movement that will suddenly happen. So we can see that there are differences in the pieces, but the overall idea here is, how are these line breaks really impacting the way that you read the poem and the way that you interpret the poem? And so I really think with Bukowski, when we pay attention to his work, we're paying attention more to syntax than meter, because as I said, he is part of that class of poets who had decided that meter wasn't really something they were going to focus on wholeheartedly, because in like the modernist era and definitely before that, in the romantic era and the classical era, these people really focused on meter per line. So the most famous type of meter per line is probably Shakespeare's Iambic Pentameter, which is not his, it's just a form of sonnet that he wrote very heavily in, but it was very typical of the time. And so the postmodern poets, so these like post-World War II poets, really focused on the idea of shirking all of that and messing with the idea of traditional line breaks and traditional meter to do something different. So this is a very interesting thing to note with him. So we're not going to spend any time on meter with him, more so the syntax. So it's really about how he phrased these lines and the words that he creates emphasis with by isolating them, and the mood of the poem, the fact that he can communicate the maybe the presence of the speaker. Like you can actually see this person in the lines that are being written, how they stumble and how they break off into uncommon patterns and things like that. This is very common of someone who has had too much to drink. So I think he does a good job with that, really communicating that. So let's talk a little bit about the exercise for this week. So what we do here, when we do the actual workshop, we would have people in the class and we would give this exercise out. Everybody would get about 10 minutes to try to do the exercise, and then we would have people share what they have. So for you, when you're watching at home by yourself, what you want to do is, after I explain the exercise, just press pause on the video, take your 10 minutes, and then go ahead and continue watching. So this is an exercise you can do in order to help you with line breaks. So it's called Break It Up. So take the following paragraph. So the following paragraph would be the one in bold. Take the following paragraph and break it up into lines. There is no wrong arrangement. Read the piece back over to yourself after you have broken it into lines. And then ask yourself, did you notice anything about the piece you didn't notice before creating the line breaks? That includes sound, metaphor, juxtaposition, any kind of poetic device, or even maybe a better understanding of the piece. Why did you choose to create the line breaks in those places? What gave you the impetus to do that? And you can say something like, it just felt right, but know that probably what that means is that that's where the natural pause in your phrasing is. So try to go a little bit deeper than that. What was the point of you creating those line breaks in those places? And what did it do to the poem? So here you have a paragraph, kind of like a prose poem, and then you broke it into lines. Did it change the poem in any way? So just kind of ask yourself these questions, write down your answers to them. So this is a poem by Ted Kruger, and I basically just took the poem and put it into a paragraph form. I took all of his line breaks out. So what you're trying to do here is to use the words that are already there and create some kind of poem with line breaks out of what's here. And then ask yourself some questions about it, okay? So why don't you go ahead and take about 10 or 15 minutes and do that, and then go ahead and hit play again. So I'm gonna give you a chance to do that really quick. Okay, so you probably have finished up with the exercise, so that's great. And I hope you learned something about line breaks from having done that. Usually this is where we would hold the workshop in the class time. So we have had opportunities for poets to present work during class time and receive feedback from myself and the other class members. So that's something that would take place in the actual workshopping time. But since we are all video recorded right now, we're gonna skip on to the prompt. So this is the last of the 5 classes. So there is no new class date, but I am gonna leave you with a final prompt that has 2 possibilities. So you can use this prompt in one of 2 ways, or you can use both of these to help you along. So this is called New and Old. The first is old, the second is new, so that's kind of funny. I should have maybe called it old and new. The first one says, go back to a poem you've already written that feels tired. So something that you're like, oh, I hate this. But there's something about it that draws you back. What I want you to do is, if there's line breaks, scrap them all. So don't just delete the line breaks, rewrite the poem in a paragraph. Don't even think about the line breaks you had before. And then once you have it in a paragraph form, rearrange the line breaks. So create some new line breaks for the piece. Use the re-rendering as an opportunity to write more or edit out. So oftentimes what happens when we try to reimagine the appearance of the poem through line breaks is we make discoveries about the work. So that's why the previous exercise asked you those questions about why you created line breaks and if you learned anything new or anything like this. But in this one, you're working with your own work. So here, you want to take the opportunity to find the gems, to really find the pieces that stand out, to find the places that maybe need to be cut or revised, or where maybe you have some disconnects. So try to do this maybe several times. If the first time it doesn't work and you're like, oh, I still hate it, put it away, come back to it, try it again, and keep doing it. See if it helps out. The next one would be do a free write where you don't use any line breaks. So this is brand new work. Write everything in paragraph form. Then put it away for at least a day. So you have written your free write, and write as much as you want, doesn't matter. And then don't look at it again. So don't reread it after you wrote it. Just write it and put it away. Then about a day goes by, at least, go back to the free write and create the line breaks. So take the free write back, use it, don't edit it, just try to break it down into line breaks. And use the opportunity to see which pieces are worth keeping and which can be revised. So this can help you, again, find the gems. So you can find the gems in old work, you can find the gems in new work. As long as you kind of use the line breaks to unlock, that's what I call it, unlock the secrets that are there. This might sound strange, but it works really well. I think it's a very useful tool. So try out one or both of these and see if they don't work for you. So I just want to say goodbye, and I want to say thank you if you've watched these videos or you've come to one of the real-time classes. I genuinely appreciate you, and we really wanted to do this just for the community, just for y'all. It was something that not only helped you, but helped me. It helped me focus on something to create new every week, and that was really good for my own mental health, and it helped me reconnect with my first art love, which is poetry. And maybe I'll spend some more time connecting with it. Reach out to us if you'd like to see a second installment of this series that teaches some additional or more advanced techniques. And please reach out, let us know how you feel about the series in general. We'd love to hear your feedback. Like I said, we genuinely appreciate you at Love Your Rebellion. Look out for more stuff that we're going to be doing. I hope you all stay well and stay sane. So bye for now.